They had lived in that house for nearly 40 years. Every corner held a memory, every creaking floorboard whispered a fragment of their shared life. Margaret and Thomas Whitman, an elderly couple in their 70s, had built a quiet, orderly existence in a small suburban neighborhood, where the loudest drama used to be a stray cat or a neighbor's misplaced lawn mower. But one evening, everything they thought they knew about safety, about trust, about their home was about to collapse. It began with a knock, soft, precise, almost hesitant. Margaret, who had been knitting by the window, frowned. It wasn't a usual hour for visitors. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep blues. Thomas, who had been in the kitchen preparing a late cup of tea, paused mid-stir, sensing the tension in her gaze. "They're here," Margaret said, her voice low, almost trembling. "Who?" Thomas asked, frowning. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, scanned the empty street. There was no car parked nearby, no familiar figure in the driveway, only shadows. And yet the knock came again, 3 sharp, insistent taps that echoed unnaturally against the siding of their old home. Thomas put down the kettle and went to the door. "Who is it?" he called. His voice carried authority tempered with caution. A muffled reply came through the doorframe, the words clipped, urgent. "Police, we need to speak with you immediately. Please open up." Thomas froze. Police? At this hour? His instincts screamed caution, yet there was something in the tone, the insistence, that unsettled him. Margaret clutched the edge of the doorway, her knuckles white as if sensing the danger before it arrived. "Thomas, I don't think it's," she started, but he cut her off gently. "I'll handle this," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. He unlocked the door slowly, revealing 2 men in dark uniforms, their badges gleaming in the dim porch light. Their faces were partially obscured by shadows, but their eyes were unnervingly cold. "Evening, folks," one of them said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "We're here on official business. May we come in?" Thomas hesitated, a knot tightening in his chest. There was a rehearsed cadence to their speech, a precision that didn't feel natural. Margaret stepped closer, whispering, "They're not normal, Thomas." The second man stepped forward, tilting his head in a way that felt both casual and menacing. "We assure you there's nothing to worry about, just a routine matter. It won't take long." Something about the way they moved, the way their eyes flicked from room to room, set Thomas on edge. His instincts, honed by years of quiet suspicion, screamed that this was wrong. "Routine?" he asked, voice firm. "At this hour?" The first man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Some matters can't wait, sir. May we come in?" Margaret's hand shot out, clutching Thomas's arm. "No," she said. Her voice, usually soft, carried a steeliness that startled even her. "We need to know who you really are." The men exchanged a glance, the kind of glance that communicated without words, a silent, chilling understanding. Then, almost casually, the first man produced a badge, holding it up for a brief moment. The gleam, the embossed lettering, the official-looking emblem, it was enough to make Thomas pause. "See," the man said smoothly, "we are police. Open the door, please." Margaret shook her head. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "I can feel it." Thomas stepped back, motioning toward the living room. "Fine, we'll talk here," he said, keeping the door slightly ajar. The men smiled. "Of course," the second said, stepping inside without waiting for a real invitation. Their shoes made no sound on the carpet, yet every step felt deliberate, invasive. The couple watched, tense, as the intruders moved through their home. It was uncanny how someone could enter a house so boldly and yet with such measured politeness. One of them perched himself casually on the arm of Thomas's recliner, a place no guest would normally assume without asking. "We're here because of an urgent matter concerning your neighborhood," the first man began, voice low, persuasive. "There have been reports, incidents that could affect you. Your safety is at risk." Margaret's heart pounded. "Incidents?" she asked, voice quivering. "What incidents?" The men exchanged another look, this one sharper, colder. The second man leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a dark secret. "We can't disclose everything yet, but know this, if you fail to cooperate, consequences could be severe." Thomas felt a chill crawl down his spine. He glanced at Margaret, who had instinctively reached for the small kitchen knife stored under the counter. He gently put a hand on hers. "Not yet," he murmured. The first man's smile twisted. "We understand fear," he said, "but this isn't about fear, it's about survival." And that was the moment the trap was fully set. The The couple realized, slowly, horrifyingly, that these men weren't officers of the law. They were something else, predators in uniform, exploiting the very thing people trusted most: authority. Thomas tried to remain calm. "What do you want?" he asked. The second man's eyes glittered. "Compliance," he said simply, and silence. Margaret felt her blood run cold. Her mind raced through every possible escape, every desperate option. The doors were locked from the inside, and the men had brought their own set of keys, or so it seemed. Every shadow in the room suddenly felt alive, every familiar object a potential threat. You can't just come in here," Margaret exclaimed. Her voice echoed against the walls of their home, but the intruders didn't flinch. "We already are in," the first man replied smoothly. "And unless you cooperate, nothing you try will matter. The next steps are simple: follow our instructions or face consequences." The couple exchanged a look, the kind of look that speaks volumes without words. Fear, anger, disbelief, and the desperate desire to protect one another filled that silent exchange. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The men moved through their routines with unnerving precision, dictating minor things with the air of authority, where the couple could sit, what they could do, when they could eat. Each command, no matter how small, was a reminder of their captivity. At some point, Margaret began to cry softly, the tears escaping despite her attempts at composure. How is this possible?" she whispered. Thomas held her hand, squeezing gently. "We'll find a way," he murmured, though his voice carried a tremor. "We always do." The men, of course, overheard. They smiled again, but it was a predator's smile, not a friendly one. "Hope is fragile," the first man said, "and fragile things break easily." As night deepened, the couple realized the true depth of their isolation. Their phones had been confiscated, or so it seemed. Their neighbors, who once represented a buffer against loneliness and danger, were now distant strangers behind closed doors. And outside, the darkness pressed in like a living entity, hiding the world beyond their small, trapped home. Yet even in that darkness, a spark of defiance remained. Thomas and Margaret exchanged another look, this one filled with resolve. Fear had entered their home, but surrender would not. They would wait, watch, and when the moment came, fight, not just for themselves, but for every fragile illusion of safety they had ever cherished. And somewhere beyond the walls, the men in uniform whispered, unaware that their careful plan might already be unraveling. Because fear can make people compliant, yes. But fear, when combined with love and resilience, can also spark a courage no badge, no threat, and no deception can completely extinguish. And so, trapped, cornered, yet unbroken, the first night began, a night that would change their lives forever. Margaret pressed her ear to the floorboards, listening for the faintest sound of escape. Thomas scanned the windows, the doors, the locked cabinets, every possible exit. They were prisoners in their own home, yet their minds, their hearts remained free. And outside, the fake police made plans for the next day, unaware that every whispered threat, every calculated move, only deepened the determination of the couple they thought they had conquered. The night stretched endlessly. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the dim light of a single lamp. Every tick of the clock was a drumbeat of suspense, a reminder that time could be both an ally and an enemy. And as Margaret finally lay down, holding Thomas's hand close, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for escape, not yet, but for strength, for clarity, and for the courage to survive what was coming. Because by dawn, nothing would be the same. The stage is set, their home is no longer a safe haven. The fake police are inside, their motives hidden, their intentions lethal. The couple's next moves will determine everything. The first light of dawn struggled through the blinds, slicing the darkness into pale, trembling stripes. The Whitmans were already awake, their bodies stiff from a restless night, yet their minds sharper than ever. Fear had a way of sharpening senses. Every creak, every distant sound seemed amplified, warning signals in a world that had suddenly become hostile. Margaret stirred, brushing her gray hair from her face, her eyes scanning the room for the slightest movement. Thomas was already at the window, his knuckles white against the frame as he peered outside. The street appeared empty, the quiet deceptive, but they knew better. Predators didn't need crowds to hunt, they needed patience and timing. "Any sign of them?" Margaret asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Thomas shook his head. "Not yet," he said, though his eyes never left the street, "but they're here, always here." The two men from the previous night had already begun their routine. One sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read a newspaper while the other moved methodically through the living room, checking the locks, inspecting small details as if to assert invisible control. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was a calculated reminder. Escape was possible only if they allowed it to be. Margaret felt a surge of anger. How can they just invade like this? It's our home. Her voice trembled, yet it carried steel. Thomas's grip on her shoulder tightened. We need to stay calm. If we lose our heads now, we lose everything. The men noticed the exchange. They didn't intervene, not yet, but their silence was heavier than any words. It pressed down on the couple, a weight of control that was suffocating in its subtlety. Hours passed, each minute a measured torment. The intruders dictated small movements, when they could sit, when they could move to another room, even when they could eat. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was brought to them in silence, placed carefully on the table, almost as if to mock their lack of freedom. Margaret, whose mind worked faster than her body could act, began forming plans. Every object in the house became a potential tool or weapon. The kitchen knives were obvious, but she also noticed the heavy candlesticks, the metal vase by the window, even the old fireplace poker stored for winter. Every mundane item suddenly held significance. Thomas, meanwhile, was focused on observation. He memorized the intruders' routines, the small tells, the pattern of their movements. One always stayed near the living room, pretending to read or watch television, while the other made rounds, inspecting locks, glancing at windows, speaking in clipped tones that never revealed their ultimate objective. Margaret, he whispered, leaning close, watch them, watch their hands, their eyes, their breathing. There's always a tell, there's always a mistake. She nodded, her own fear mingling with determination. They might be trapped physically, but mentally they could remain free. By midday, the tension had become unbearable. The men, sensing the restlessness, began to manipulate the couple with small psychological tactics. Your neighbors have been asking questions, the first man said casually, as if sharing trivial information. They're concerned about you, but they won't intervene, not for long. Margaret's stomach churned. The thought of the world outside, their neighbors' ignorance, made the walls of the house feel even more suffocating. Thomas's jaw tightened. It's all lies, he murmured. They want us to panic. And panic, they knew, could be dangerous. Every movement, every glance had to be measured. One misstep could provoke the intruders, could trigger something far worse than mere confinement. Hours stretched. Afternoon turned to evening and the tension thickened. Margaret and Thomas moved slowly, deliberately, under the watchful eyes of the men. Even breathing felt like an act of defiance. They had to appear compliant while thinking, planning, surviving. It was then that the first man leaned closer to Thomas, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. You know, Mr. Whitman, fear can be useful. It teaches people obedience. It exposes weaknesses. Thomas's hands tightened into fists, but he kept his composure. And courage? He asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. What about courage? The man's smile was faint, predatory. Courage is irrelevant. Eventually, everyone submits everyone. Margaret's mind raced. They needed leverage, some way to turn even the smallest advantage in their favor. She noted the intruders' reliance on routine, the subtle confidence that comes from assuming total control. Every detail mattered. Every hesitation, every glance away. Every small act of complacency, these could be exploited. As evening fell, the fake police became bolder. They began moving the couple around the house under pretext, insisting they tidy up, organize items, comply with unspecified instructions. Every movement, every command was a test of obedience and fear. Margaret noticed a small detail, a window slightly ajar in the back, one the intruders hadn't checked thoroughly. It was her first spark of hope, but getting there would require patience, cunning, and timing. Thomas, sensing her thought, leaned close. I saw that too, he whispered. Tonight, when they're distracted, we'll act. The day dragged on. The couple's minds worked furiously while their bodies remained trapped. Every small interaction, every carefully measured sentence became a dance of survival. They learned to speak without revealing intent, to nod without surrendering, to exist in the space between compliance and strategy. The men, for all their bluster, had overlooked one key truth. The Whitmans had lived a lifetime of subtle observation, of careful analysis, of quiet resilience. Fear could intimidate them, yes, but it could not break them, not yet. As night approached, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. The men's movements became more casual, more careless, a dangerous sign. They spoke in half-whispered tones about matters the couple was only beginning to understand. "You see, control is an art," the first man said, almost to himself, "and they're learning slowly, but the lesson must continue." Margaret's heart pounded. Thomas's jaw was set, his eyes sharp. The couple exchanged a look that spoke louder than words: patience, observation, and the quiet, unyielding determination to survive. By midnight, the men had settled into a routine, leaving one in the living room and the other packing or checking items periodically. That was the moment Margaret and Thomas had been waiting for. Margaret touched Thomas's hand lightly, a silent signal. He nodded. Every breath, every glance, every small movement had been timed. Now they had an opening, a chance, however slim, to reclaim even a fraction of their home. The first attempt would be subtle, a probing test, a feeler to gauge the intruder's reactions. Margaret moved toward the back, careful, slow, each step deliberate. Thomas followed, watching, ready to act at the slightest signal. And then, just as they reached the window, the packing intruder stopped abruptly, sensing movement. "You're moving," he said sharply, turning, his voice cut through the quiet like a knife. Margaret froze, Thomas tensed, their hearts raced. The moment of action had arrived sooner than they had planned. The next minutes would decide everything: freedom, captivity, life, or something darker. Outside, the night was indifferent, holding its secrets in the shadows. Inside, the house, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield of wills, courage, and calculated fear. And the Whitmans, elderly, worn by time yet unbroken in spirit, were about to test the limits of their resilience against forces that should never have been allowed inside their home. Because in the end, captivity is not just physical. It is psychological, emotional, and moral. And the true measure of a person is revealed not when life is easy, but when every familiar corner becomes a trap, every trusted symbol a lie, and every breath a negotiation with fear itself. The first move had been made. The next would determine the course of the night and perhaps the fate of everyone involved. The house held its breath. The couple held theirs. And outside, unseen, the world waited, ignorant of the quiet, deadly tension that had taken root in a small suburban home. The night had deepened into a silence so thick it pressed against the Whitmans' ears, making every small sound feel amplified, almost ominous. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien, its walls shrinking, its corners harboring invisible threats. Margaret's hand gripped Thomas as they approached the slightly ajar back window. Every step was deliberate, measured, their breath held in tense synchrony. The intruder in the living room had paused, perhaps sensing movement, perhaps caught in his own complacency. Margaret's mind raced. Could they slip past him? Could they finally take one small step toward freedom? Thomas's whisper broke the tension. "Wait for it now." Margaret turned the window handle with the utmost care, careful not to make a sound. The intruder remained motionless, reading, packing, or simply existing, unaware, at least for now, that the couple was preparing to act. Then a soft click. The window opened just enough. A narrow sliver of night air entered the room, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of fear. Thomas slid the screen aside with trembling hands. Margaret leaned forward, ready to slip through, when the first intruder's voice, calm yet chilling, sliced through the room. "Going somewhere." They froze. The words, casual as they were, carried a threat they couldn't ignore. The intruder had turned, eyes sharp, catching the subtle movement. Thomas's mind raced. "Stay calm," he whispered. "We don't panic, we adapt." Margaret nodded, forcing her pulse to slow. She stepped back, retreating from the window, and nodded toward the kitchen. They needed another plan, another diversion. The house was their prison, but it was also their terrain. Every object, every shadow could be a weapon or a lure. The second intruder, now aware of the movement near the back, approached cautiously. "I told you, compliance is safer, don't make this difficult." Margaret's eyes scanned the room. The fireplace poker, the metal candlestick, the heavy vase, all possibilities. Her mind calculated distances, angles, noise potential. Thomas whispered an idea, low and urgent. "The stove, if we can create a distraction, even a small one." Margaret understood immediately. They had to act, but subtly. The stove in the kitchen was old, temperamental. With a little effort, they could create smoke, a hiss, a warning signal that would draw the intruder's attention without immediate suspicion. Carefully, they moved toward the kitchen, keeping low. Each creak of the floorboard threatened to betray them, each shadow a potential observer. Margaret's hands shook, but her resolve never wavered. Thomas followed, eyes fixed on the living room where the intruder remained seated, seemingly casual yet alert. Margaret flicked on the stove, turning the burner to high. Within moments, the faint smell of burning food began to fill the kitchen, a soft plume of smoke curling upward. She nudged a small pan into the flame, ensuring the smoke would thicken just enough to create concern. The effect was almost immediate. The intruder in the living room sniffed the air, his eyes narrowing. "What's that smell?" he muttered. Rising, he moved toward the kitchen, leaving the other intruder momentarily distracted. Thomas seized the chance. "Now," he whispered. He opened the back window fully, peering into the darkened backyard. The ground was uneven, but there was a path toward the fence, a slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. Margaret stepped first, her body tense, balancing on the edge of fear and courage. Thomas followed. Every muscle ached with the strain of suppressed panic and adrenaline. They had made it outside, yet the danger was far from over. The intruder's voice carried through the kitchen window. "Don't even think about it." They ran. The cold night air hit their faces, shocking their senses, fueling their desperation. Each step was careful but urgent, navigating the narrow backyard path, every shadow a potential obstacle. And then, a sound that froze them mid-step. The second intruder had realized their movement, moving toward the window with a speed that belied his age. Thomas grabbed Margaret, pulling her behind a bush. "We can't outrun them," he whispered. "We have to hide." They crouched, hearts hammering, as the intruder reached the window, his hands pressed against the glass, peering inside, his face a mask of suspicion and frustration. But he didn't see them, not yet. Margaret's mind raced, calculating options. The neighbors' houses were close, but their doors were locked, blinds drawn. Calling for help would alert the intruders to their exact location. Escape was possible, but only if they could outthink their captors, outmaneuver their control. Thomas noticed a small gate at the far end of the yard. It was old, slightly rusted, but it could give them a route out. He nudged Margaret gently. "There," he whispered. "If we can make it to the gate, we might have a chance." They moved cautiously, using the shadows as cover, each step deliberate. The intruder at the window had turned his attention back inside, distracted by the smoke that now filled the kitchen. It was the only advantage the couple had. As they reached the gate, a loud creak echoed in the yard, Margaret's foot on a loose board. They froze, hearts in their throats. The intruder spun around, eyes scanning the darkness. Then, unexpectedly, a third figure appeared. A neighbor, a passerby, or another threat, they couldn't tell. The figure's presence added a new layer of danger and opportunity. "Who's there?" the intruder shouted, turning toward the movement. Margaret and Thomas held their breath, hiding behind the gate. The stranger moved cautiously, seemingly unaware of the intruders inside. Relief and fear collided within the couple. This could be their chance or a trap they hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, the intruder inside the kitchen spotted the smoke and shouted, "Get back here, don't let them escape." The tension was unbearable. Margaret felt her knees weaken, Thomas's grip the only thing holding her steady. Every instinct screamed flight, every calculation screamed caution. They had made it this far, but the final steps would demand everything they had: courage, timing, and sheer determination. And then, as if fate itself had intervened, a small car approached down the street, headlights cutting through the darkness. The intruders paused, distracted by the noise, their attention divided. Thomas whispered, urgent but quiet, "Now, Margaret, we move fast." They bolted, sprinting toward the gate, using the darkness as their ally. The intruders shouted, chaos erupting inside the house, but the couple didn't stop. They ran, hearts pounding, lungs burning, until the safety of the shadows beyond their property lines swallowed them whole. For a brief, shining moment, freedom seemed within reach. They had escaped the immediate grasp of their captors. But the ordeal was far from over. The night held dangers they couldn't yet see, and the men in uniform would not let go easily. Margaret and Thomas slowed their pace, hiding behind a row of trees, catching their breath. The adrenaline that had fueled them now gave way to a deep, trembling exhaustion. Every muscle ached, every nerve screamed. But even in that moment, one thing was clear: they had survived the first battle. They had outwitted the predators, at least for now. And that knowledge, however fragile, carried a power the intruders could not understand, the power of determination, of love, and of refusal to be conquered. The night stretched before them, dark and uncertain, but the Whitmans had proven something vital. Even when trapped, even when terrified, even when confronted with forces that seemed insurmountable, the human spirit could endure, could fight, could escape. And somewhere in the house they had left behind, the fake police seethed, realizing that the couple they had underestimated were not so easily controlled. Their mistake would cost them more than they could imagine. Margaret whispered, clutching Thomas's hand, "We can't stop, not yet, we have to see this through." Thomas nodded, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. "We'll get through this, together, no matter what." The night, indifferent and endless, bore witness to their courage. And though they were far from safe, the Whitmans had taken the first step toward reclaiming not just their freedom but their lives. But the story was far from over. The intruders would regroup, plans would shift, and the darkness held more than just shadows. It held secrets, lies, and the kind of danger that could reach even the most vigilant. And so in the stillness of the night, the couple pressed on, hearts bound by fear, love, and an unyielding determination to survive whatever came next. The darkness of the night wrapped around Margaret and Thomas like a heavy cloak, concealing their every move yet amplifying every sound: the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a streetlight, the faint crunch of gravel beneath their shoes. They had made it out of the house, but the threat was far from over. The fake police had not been ordinary intruders. They were organized, calculating, and far more dangerous than either of them had imagined. Margaret clutched Thomas's arm, her fingers trembling but resolute. "We need a plan," she whispered. "We can't just run blindly." Thomas nodded, scanning the quiet suburban street. The neighborhood was asleep, unaware that chaos had visited one of its own homes. "The main road," he murmured. "We follow it. There's a 24-hour store a few blocks away. People, phones, help." Every step toward the road was a test of nerve. They stayed low, moving through the shadows, careful not to be seen. Every car that passed, every stray cat that scurried across the street made their hearts jump. Fear had sharpened their senses, made them hyper-aware, but it also fed their resolve. They could not go back, not now, not ever. The first intruder emerged from the house, the smell of smoke still lingering in his clothes. His face was twisted in anger, frustration etched into every line. He scanned the street, calling out, "They can't have gone far, check every exit." Margaret and Thomas froze behind a low hedge, hearts pounding, sweat cooling in the night air. The intruder's flashlight beam swept across the lawn, casting jagged shadows. For a terrifying moment, they thought they had been spotted. Then the intruder moved on, muttering to himself, clearly irritated by their absence. He had underestimated them. He had assumed fear would render them compliant, but the Whitmans were no longer victims, they were survivors. They reached the main road, keeping to the shadows, moving swiftly but silently. The distant neon glow of the convenience store offered hope, a sanctuary, witnesses, a lifeline. Margaret's pulse raced with each step, but with it came a rising surge of determination. They had survived the night, now survival meant reaching help. Suddenly, a sound behind them, a subtle shift of movement, a footstep on gravel, made both spin around. The second intruder had emerged, moving cautiously but with purpose. Thomas grabbed Margaret's hand, pulling her toward an alley that ran parallel to the main street. They slipped into its darkness, hearts hammering. The intruder's flashlight sliced through the night, its beam passing over their hiding spot by mere inches. Margaret whispered urgently, "We can't stop now, keep going." The alley led them behind a row of houses, the darkness providing temporary cover. They paused, breathing heavily, listening. No sound of pursuit yet. The absence of sound was a dangerous kind of silence, one that promised sudden danger if they allowed themselves to relax. Finally, the glow of the store appeared through the trees. Relief surged, but caution remained. The automatic doors slid open as they approached, and the bright fluorescent lights revealed aisles of mundane, comforting normalcy. People, customers, a cashier looked up, startled by two disheveled figures entering with wide, fearful eyes. "Please," Thomas gasped, approaching the counter. We need help. There are men, fake police, they've trapped us in our home." The cashier's eyes widened. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone, dialing 911. The Whitmans' voices trembled, but for the first time in hours, hope replaced the suffocating fear. Minutes stretched, each one dragging as they recounted their ordeal to the dispatcher. The sense of helplessness slowly gave way to action. Police were on their way, and now the Whitmans could finally breathe, not fully, not yet, but enough to gather their strength. Meanwhile, back at the house, the first intruder was fuming. The smoke had cleared, but the couple was gone. Frustration turned to panic. They had not expected such ingenuity, such courage from an elderly pair they had assumed would crumble under fear. The second intruder returned from the alley, shaking his head. "They're gone," they escaped. The first man's eyes burned with cold fury. "No one escapes, we finish what we start, find them now." But their pursuit was too late. By the time they reached the street, the Whitmans were already in the store, safe under the protection of others, recounting the harrowing night in full detail. Authorities arrived shortly after, their presence a sudden, undeniable force against the intruders' carefully orchestrated control. The police moved quickly. Officers surrounded the Whitmans' home, cautious but methodical. Every room was searched, every lock checked, every suspicious detail documented. And then discovery, evidence of the intruders' deception, fake badges, altered identification, tools for coercion and intimidation. They had prepared meticulously to terrorize, manipulate, and control. But in the end, evidence mattered more than bravado. The first intruder attempted to flee but was intercepted by uniformed officers who had arrived just in time. The second followed, cornered and desperate. Both were arrested, their faces pale, their plans unraveled. The Whitmans had survived not just physically but psychologically. They had outlasted, outsmarted, and endured. Back in the store, Margaret and Thomas sat together, their hands entwined. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, but so did a profound sense of relief. Tears flowed freely, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that they had faced terror and lived. Margaret leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder. I thought this was the end," she whispered. Thomas kissed her forehead gently. "It's never the end," he replied, "not when we have each other, not when we fight." The police thanked them for their clarity, their presence of mind, their courage. Statements were taken, photographs collected, evidence preserved. And in the midst of bureaucracy, Margaret and Thomas understood something vital. Their ordeal had revealed the resilience of ordinary people, the quiet strength that comes from love, experience, and the refusal to be broken. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with the story. Whispers of terror, disbelief, and admiration spread. The Whitmans became, quietly, a symbol not of fear but of survival, of moral courage, of the power of ordinary individuals to confront extraordinary threats. Their home, now cleared and secured by authorities, remained theirs, but nothing inside or outside would ever feel the same. Every creaking floorboard, every shadow, every knock at the door carried echoes of the night they had survived. Margaret and Thomas, however, had changed. They were no longer just an elderly couple living quietly in suburbia. They were survivors, warriors of circumstance, and guardians of their own courage. Fear had entered their lives, yes, but so had triumph, clarity, and an unbreakable bond that no force, no deception, no fake authority could ever sever. And as they sat together in their living room once more, sunlight streaming through the blinds, they made a silent promise. Never again would they allow fear to dictate their lives. Never again would they assume safety where none was guaranteed. And above all, they would carry the lesson of that night, a lesson about vigilance, courage, and the human spirit forever. The intruders had believed themselves powerful, untouchable, and feared. But in reality, they had underestimated the very thing they sought to destroy: the quiet, persistent, unyielding strength of ordinary people who refused to surrender. Margaret and Thomas had been trapped, terrorized, and threatened, yet in the end they were free, free not just in body but in spirit. And in that freedom lay a triumph more profound than any comfort, any peace, any normalcy they had ever known. The night of terror had ended, but its lesson would remain forever etched in their hearts. And as they held each other, breathing in the calm after the storm, they knew one undeniable truth: courage is not the absence of fear, it is the refusal to be ruled by it.